Okay, friends, before we hop into it, disclaimer. You are not losing your mind if you are hearing sounds where there is nothing happening on the screen. I don't know what happened when I uploaded my videos to the program in which I put them all together, but yeah, I apologize. It is 11:30 at night and I still haven't gotten my Wednesday video up, so the audio is what it is. But no, you are not losing your mind if you hear sounds like a brayer and that's not happening on the screen. I don't know what happened either. It is day 26 of my 100 collage papers and I'm starting a new theme. Some of you won't like this one very well. Altering book pages. I have an old Dover thrift edition, previously used in one of my favorite small collages, and I'm going to tear out some pages. I like this because the text is small and dense. While I like using text in my collage, I don't like it to be super visible because my brain wants to try to read it, and if anyone is just focused on words and letters, they're missing the bigger picture. I'm starting out with some neutrals with varying levels of coverage. Nothing fancy, but quite useful to have in our stash. I'll be starting with white gesso to mute the text. As is so common for me, I got too much on, so wasn't able to vary the coverage as much. But I did use my handy dandy subway card. An old plastic credit card type card is definitely a tool you want to have in your collage paper and mixed media art making toolkit. I spread gesso on each of my sheets. As you can see, I had enough from the first to use on all three. I decided to experiment with some metallic ink. Copper is my favorite. You can see the difference of how it spreads on the gesso that is drier and wetter. Next up, black gesso, a little bit of which goes a surprisingly long way. I used my cardigan and on the second sheet experimented with using the edge a little bit differently. I wasn't thrilled with how it was looking overall, but I knew there would be interesting bits and that's all I need. And I added some silver to the final one. And here are the results. The white did dry more translucent than I expected, and the metallic in the wet gesso, as I mentioned, it doesn't show up as much. It looks almost like reddish brown, but there's more copper visible on this one. All in all, interesting enough results. And on to the black. The text is pretty much obliterated on this one, which is not what I was going for, but that will be interesting. As I said, this has lots of interesting bits. And there is the final piece with some silver shimmer. Collage paper number 27 is covering book pages with paint and then removing some to reveal some of the text. I don't like having big chunks of text visible to invite distraction by reading, which makes it sound like I don't like reading. However, I would love to encourage people to read. And if seeing text in my artwork reminds people of what a great thing reading a book is, that's great. But in general, collage fodder is meant to be part of a whole. And part of me feels like I'm digging a hole. So let's just move on to the art. I compared a black gesso, Mars Black Liquitex Basics fluid acrylic, which I figured would be a little too wet to work well, but again, as I've mentioned in past videos, I prefer the black of the Mars Black over my ivory black in the tube, and some inexpensive Craft Smart acrylic craft paint, of which the craft paint came the closest to performing in the way I wanted it to. I thought perhaps gessoing the paper so it didn't immediately absorb so much paint could possibly help, and since the goal was to have some text showing in the areas I removed the paint, I decided to move forward with just the craft paint over a layer of clear gesso. No surprise, I applied too much, so ended up with some extra sheets Before I started on my dry gessoed sheets, I took another look at the black. This is the black gesso. You may kind of think there might be words there. The fluid acrylic. In both, the stamped circles pretty much disappeared. And yeah, the craft paint definitely worked more as I intended. So here is the long story short of what I learned using the craft paint over the gesso, which I'd basically already realized but failed to follow through on. Let the paint sit as short a time as possible. The longer it sits, the more it dries, and the less well it is removed. The less well it can be removed. This stripe came out great. Okay, everything is dry. So the key is not letting it sit too long, which I kind of knew, but I was stubborn to find something I could reuse to wipe my shaper off on. And I really like some of the different effects with the excess paint. So as far as covering book pages, the cheapest yet effective method would be plain old acrylic craft paint. And how cool is that? Collage papers 28 and 29 continue with the old book page theme. One inspired by something I saw from Foyle Davies, and the other using a less than awesome result from another recent collage paper, specifically number 25. I'm using my 5x7 gel plate because it is closest in size to my book pages, and since I don't think that an image transfer would work well on a book page, I am going to do a simple tissue paper pull and adhere that to my book page. I'm starting with this image from a Southern Living magazine. To be honest, I'm not too sure if the pages are thick enough and the image is well enough inked, but I'm going to try it. I'm cutting out around it, but I will use a large index card to pull up more of the paint, but evenly. Payne's Gray Liquitex Basics acrylic paint. Payne's Gray I usually prefer to black. I was afraid I got a little too much, so I tried to remove some of it, brayered it out. The fact that my image was a little beat up may have contributed to it not being ideal, but I'm going to also go with my previous assessment that it's just not a good magazine for this. I did use the card that I had put the extra paint on, and I think it looks pretty cool. And the image transfer was hard to tell, but it looked kind of decent, but I didn't know where that extra splotch came from. I didn't try to remove it because I was afraid I'd ruin it, but this looked better than it came out. Somehow the tissue paper just did not pull enough of the paint. There was enough left on the gel plate though that I decided to add a pull layer of color and see what I could get. Too much medium squirted out. I think this looks pretty interesting. While my image transfer paint dried, I decided to move on to my next idea, which actually became tissue paper number 28, while this one stayed 29 because, well, I needed to keep working on it. A less than stellar version of Collage Paper 25 becomes the next cover for a book page. As I mentioned, I like to obscure big sections of text. And this may also give you an idea of why I like to work with layers of translucent tissue paper in collage, and may give you an idea of how it works if you have never painted with paper, as Maribeth Quinn calls it. It was from Maribeth Quinn that I also picked up my favorite adhesive for using with tissue paper, Golden's Satin Glazing Liquid. It's not super shiny like a gloss, and I like the matte mediums okay. However, the glazing liquid works great, and it doesn't get your fingers all sticky. It's kind of amazing when you compare it to how sticky you can get with building layers with matte medium quite quickly. Which reminds me of relatively recently participating in Kat Rain's collage keepsake class, which is how I started making my jewelry, by the way, working predominantly with matte medium in what she calls a harvest collage. My fingers got so sticky. And also, as I was working, my fingers started feeling so strange. But it wasn't until I wasn't hyper-focused on creating that I realized exactly how strange they felt. And then I realized how smooth they were, and realized my fingertips were completely coated in matte medium that I had to peel off. As you have probably noticed, I put down a layer of glazing liquid beneath my tissue paper and above. I often like wrinkles, and of course this paper is particularly wrinkly, but you do have to do some smoothing with your fingers for it all to properly adhere. And here we have adding layers. You can build up areas with more color. Of course, here I am working just with bronze. And I definitely prefer copper the more I'm working with the bronze, which I already assumed I would. Working so much with metallics is relatively new for me, and that's another thing to thank Froyle Davies for. These book pages are quite absorbent, so I had to add glazing liquid in some places. Wet tissue paper tears very easily, which is very convenient for edges. I still have some pretty bare looking spots and some metallic on here, so yeah, build up a little more. And let everything dry. And back to pulling what was left of my poor little orange tree. It's interesting. Parts of it are more recognizable as a tree than others. Not a raging success. The roll-off sheet is interesting. The tissue paper is pretty useless, but I can use it again later. And try another image. Trim one edge so I have a better idea of where to lay it on the plate. Yeah, no, not awesome. There was still some of the gray image left on the plate, so why not add a pull layer? and try for a fun bonus paper like the first time I did an image transfer. Another nope. I figured this didn't have enough contrast, but why not try? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? And if it did work, it would be really interesting. Yeah, I don't think. Nope. But this looks kind of cool. I forgot to start the camera when I painted a background on the page. I had gotten some yellow paint on her when I tested it. I thought it was still a little too dark, so I added a layer of white. In retrospect, I should have used more of the pink. And I can really show you why. Well, you can already see why. Look at the upper right corner. And things need to dry. And I did not forget my bronze page. So here we are, all dry here. I did kind of like the raggedy edge, but since that would be pretty transparent above the paper, trimming all of the edges, I can't say that I'm loving the bronze. But this is a workable concept, and it might be a good filler somewhere. And back to my dry image transfer. Yes, trimming. And yes, way too white through there. And as I pointed out, that color looks really cool. And interesting leftovers, but oh my goodness, her mustache. Collage paper number 29. I am so happy that I finally got this right. After all the missteps, I decided to do a straight pull. I am happy to have my image transfer mojo back. Her image did dry before the colorful paint pull layer. Sadly, my medium and large brayers are out of commission. Even more drying of the paint beneath the book page. But no drying required for my fun extra pull. Town & Country magazine remains the only one I've gotten really good results with. So satisfying to have finally gotten it right again. Since obscuring some of the text in my book page collage papers is my goal, I thought Baby Powder Resist would be ideal. The first sheet will have a translucent undercoat of Liquitex Basics Brilliant Yellow Green. So as well as text, the places that the powder keeps the paint from being picked up will also show green. Page 2 will be a single baby powdered pull, and page 3 will have 2 pulls. This layer is quinacridone magenta. Good layer of paint, smoothly brayered out, and then a healthy sprinkling of baby powder. Don't wait to put on the book pages. You don't want your paint to dry. Make sure they are smoothly applied, and then pull them up for an interesting starry look. Pages 1 and 2 are done, but I will add another layer to page 3 so you can get an idea of how you can keep playing with this technique for different effects. Adding a layer of phthalo blue. I will say I don't particularly care for the baby powder I got, and although baby powder is supposed to work easier with this, I prefer the cornstarch I tried before Christmas, not on book pages. I don't recall the cornstarch ever having areas where it was so powdery it created such a large masked area. I will say, however, that when looking at it from the perspective of trying to create a galaxy outer space look, it is rather effective, at least on a multi-layered page. Collage paper number 31. I thought plastic wrap on acrylic paint would be great for a book page. Again, with my whole wanting to show some text, I thought the bare book page might not work so well, so I decided to compare it to clear gesso and white gesso. Clear gesso is quite grainy because it's more for adding tooth to a smooth surface, which is why I also used the white gesso. As I knew my inexpensive acrylic craft paints would work just fine because I used them for this on an art journal page on the 52-week art journal journey, why bother experimenting with something more expensive, especially after its success on collage paper number 27. Each page got lots of water and a decent amount of paint and some more water, and then a piece of plastic wrap with lots of nice big wrinkles. This required a lot of drying time, and by a lot of drying time, I mean a lot of drying time. When I peeled the plastic up about 24 hours later, the gessoed pages were both still wet in places. I had to move all 3 sheets off of the palette paper I had them on because everything was so saturated hours later. Way different from when I did this on the gorgeous heavy mixed media paper of the art journals I use for my art prompt videos. I think this is the first experiment that I really have no interest in pursuing further experimentation. At least not on porous old book pages. The technique may turn up again in my 100 collage papers, but definitely, no, not on book pages. The first page, the ungessoed page, which I was afraid wouldn't work at all, turned out to be the best of the 3 as far as completely drying and being able to see more areas of text. As you can see, it does have some cool effects, which is why I will most likely be revisiting it later in my 100 collage papers on different paper. This is my favorite piece I have made with book pages. I display it on a shelf in my living room with this lucite frame. Art like this can sit on a shelf, on a table, very convenient. With this flower in mind and enjoying creating inspiration fodder as last week, I decided to make some inspiration fodder out of book pages for collage paper number 32, the final in this week of book page alteration. I thought I would play with my watercolor blobs that I love making. I knew they would behave differently on the porous book pages as they did, but the color mixing was really interesting. Throwback to the blending complementary colors to tone them down. So my goal is to make the watercolor blobs and have a watercolor wash to draw a flower on the back of to cut out for inspiration fodder. But I found working with the watercolor on the book page was really interesting, and I decided to experiment with some wrinkles. And I apologize for the sound because I am recording in my car, which I ended up having to do last Wednesday evening too, but at least then I had my microphone, and now the sky is pelting ice at me. So here we are. I decided to play with colors some more on the 3rd page. Of course, I was working backward across the desk, but that's okay. I figured I would wrinkle it up and see about running rivulets through the valleys, similarly to what I have in the past. But the one thing about the book pages and their absorbency is the wrinkles flatten out with more water. So if I long story short, today's collage paper, it would be inspiration fodder that didn't give much inspiration to become fodder and became these gorgeous watercolor pages.